While I slept, my brother made a move I never expected. Have you ever felt something you can't explain, something that just doesn't seem right? Last night, something happened that left me questioning everything. My brother, someone I thought I knew so well, did something while I was asleep that I never saw coming. And now I can't stop thinking. What does it mean? What happens next? Stay with me, because the story is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss how it unfolds. I sat on the terrace wrapped in a soft blanket, feeling the cool evening air pleasantly chill my face. The sun was slowly sinking beyond the horizon, leaving a golden trail across the lake's surface. Next to me was a cup of green tea, still faintly steaming, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. Andrew had only recently moved in with me after his parents' difficult divorce. At 18, he looked much older. There was a mix of sadness and fatigue in his eyes, as if he had seen too much for his age. I hadn't seen him look so contemplative in a long time. Today he seemed especially quiet, and I sensed he needed space to process everything that had happened to him. "On Evelyn," he called softly as he stepped onto the terrace. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, shifting uneasily from foot to foot. "Is there anything I can help you with?" I smiled, feeling that there was more to his offer than just politeness. "Of course you can. How about helping me with the garden? The roses need some extra care. They've been especially picky this year." Andrew smiled, and I saw a spark of interest in his eyes. We grabbed the tools and headed to the garden. As we worked together, I began to recall those summer vacations he spent with us as a child, little Andrew running around the garden in shorts with dirty hands, smiling at me with every memory. "Remember when you fell into the pond trying to catch a frog?" I laughed, reminding him of those funny moments that once seemed so important. "How could I forget? You jumped in to save me right away, only to fall into the water right after." He smiled, and the same boyish joy flickered in his eyes again. We laughed together, and I felt a warm, almost familial bond form between us again. The evening embraced us softly with its coolness, and I realized this moment had become an oasis in the storm of emotions that both of us had been going through in recent months. When the garden was in order, we returned to the terrace, enjoying the silence and the sunset. Just when I thought the day had come to an end, I noticed that Andrew was watching me intently. There was something new and inexplicable in his gaze, as if he were trying to understand something important. I felt a slight nervousness, but decided not to dwell on it. Suddenly, Andrew came closer to me. "You know," he began quietly, "I've always known you're not like everyone else. You've always understood me better than anyone." I froze for a moment, feeling a warm sensation rising inside. "Andrew, you've always been dear to me. You know that?" I said gently. His gaze did not leave mine. At some point, I saw his eyes deepen, as if he had made an inner decision. But instead of continuing the conversation, he suddenly leaned in and lightly touched my lips with his. It was quick, almost fleeting, but I felt my heart suddenly stop. I pulled away, embarrassed and surprised, feeling a wave of warmth wash over my face. An awkward silence hung in the air, but I didn't want to break the moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice full of regret and confusion. "I don't know why I did that." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "It's okay," I finally said, although my thoughts swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. "Just let's forget about it." "Okay." He nodded, but his gaze remained attentive, almost studying. I tried to smile, but inside I felt something inexplicable begin to slowly make its way into my heart. The next day, I woke up early, hoping to distract myself from the thoughts of the previous evening. In the kitchen, I heard the clatter of dishes and immediately realized that Andrew was already up. I wanted to avoid meeting him, to give myself some time to think things over, but it was hard to hide in a small house. I gathered my courage and walked into the kitchen, trying to appear calm. Andrew stood by the stove frying eggs. He looked focused, but I noticed how he glanced at me briefly, his face reflecting something between nervousness and anticipation. "Good morning," he said too cheerfully, as if trying to dispel some tension. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Breakfast for both of us." Of course, he smiled, but there was a barely noticeable shadow in his smile. We ate breakfast almost in silence, and I could feel an awkward silence hanging between us. I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened, but I wasn't ready to bring it up. In the end, I decided that we needed something to do to ease the tension a little. "Andrew," I said, trying to put as much confidence into my voice as possible, "would you help me with the old shed? There's something that needs fixing, and I can't manage it on my own." "Sure. Why not?" he answered, clearly glad for the opportunity to distract himself. We went to the old shed, where garden tools and wooden crates were stored. I turned on the light, and the dim bulbs illuminated the dusty room with a soft yellow glow. We started sorting tools, moving boxes, and discussing what should be kept and what should be thrown away. With every minute spent in that cramped space, I felt the tension between us growing. His presence seemed too close, too palpable. I buried myself in a shelf, trying to focus on what I was doing, when I suddenly felt his gaze on me. "You can't just pretend nothing happened," he said quietly, his voice a mix of embarrassment and determination. I froze, feeling my heart start to beat faster. Andrew, I'm not sure we should be discussing this. I replied, trying to sound calm, but inside, a storm was raging. He took a step closer, his voice growing more intense. No, we have to, because I feel that something important happened, and you know it too. I turned away, not knowing what to say. His words were direct, but at the same time, there was something in them that touched me. At that moment, I felt his hand touch mine. I turned sharply to face him and saw his eyes deep, filled with emotions. He couldn't hide, Andrew, don't I whispered, but he stepped even closer. I could feel his breath on my skin, and at that moment, everything around us seemed to disappear suddenly and abruptly, as if it were beyond his control. He kissed me again. This kiss was entirely different, more insistent, with a hint of desperate need for a response. For a moment, I stood still, but then I stepped back, feeling my head spin. No, this is wrong, I said, pulling away, but unable to tear my gaze from his eyes. I didn't know what to do next or how to react. It all seemed too confusing and dangerous. Andrew immediately backed away, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, I just can't figure out what's happening. His voice trembled, and I realized he truly didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Andrew, we need to set boundaries. What's happening could hurt us both. I said softly, trying to calm both him and myself. He nodded, but his gaze showed that he didn't agree. Just let me figure this out, he muttered, and I sensed that this conversation would continue, would build up like a wave ready to crash on the shore. We returned to the house in silence, each lost in our thoughts, but I knew one thing. This story was only beginning, and it would unfold further, leaving neither of us unchanged in the days that followed. I tried to behave as if nothing had happened. I immersed myself in routine, planned meetings with friends, took care of household chores, and tended to the garden. But every time I saw Andrew, his presence triggered a sense of unease within me that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. I noticed he was also trying to avoid conversations and even eye contact. This made our living under the same roof feel strange and tense, so I decided that we needed to break this cycle of awkwardness and distract ourselves with something completely different. Andrew, I said one morning over breakfast, trying to sound casual, how about we go to the farmer's market in the neighboring town today? We could take a walk and buy some fresh produce. Maybe it will help us relax a bit. He looked at me with slight surprise, but then nodded. Why not? He said, his voice, even though I caught a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, perhaps he too felt this was an attempt to ease the tension that had become almost unbearable. We drove to the nearby town on a narrow road lined with fields and forests. I turned on the radio, and the music filled the car, attempting to fill the silence between us. We exchanged a few words about the weather, about how long it had been since we last visited the market, but every conversation felt forced and unnatural at the market. The air was filled with the sense of fresh fruit, pastries, and flowers. We wandered between the stalls. I tried to appear cheerful, but constantly felt his presence nearby, too close, too palpable. We bought some apples, cheese, and bread. Everything seemed ordinary, but beneath the surface, I sensed something strange and unknown. Amazing. As we passed by an antique shop, Andrew suddenly stopped and pointed to the window. Evelyn looked. He said. His voice was unexpectedly animated. I turned and saw that he was pointing at an old music box adorned with faded gold and ceramic inserts. For a moment, my breath caught. That's I began, but my voice trembled. It looks like my grandmother's, I finally said, unable to take my eyes off the box. It does. Andrew came closer, his fingers touching the glass of the window. You said it was very dear to you. I nodded, feeling goosebumps run across my skin. Yes, it was her jewelry box. She kept old letters and photographs in it. Andrew was silent, but I saw that he was watching me intently, as if trying to understand why this mattered so much. Do you want to go inside? He asked quietly. I nodded, and we entered the antique shop. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust. The box sat on a shelf among many other forgotten objects. I took it in my hands and carefully opened it. Inside lay an old dried rose and several yellowed letters. Andrew glanced at the letters, and something in his expression changed. Can I take a look? He asked, cautiously. I handed him the letters, and he began to leaf through them. His face growing serious. There's something here about our family, he said, sounding almost surprised by his discovery about some arguments that happened before I was born. I felt a surge of anxiety rising within me. These letters. I didn't know they still existed. I said, suddenly wanting to take them back from him, but he continued reading, and suddenly his face darkened. Why didn't you ever tell me about those events? Evelyn, his voice was restrained, but I could sense his agitation. This isn't something you talk about over dinner. I tried to joke, but I could hear the tremor in my voice. Andrew, some things are better left in the past. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Maybe, he replied quietly, but I'm beginning to realize that there is much more hidden in our family than it seems. I felt a chill in my chest, the letters, the old music box, the tension between us. It all began to form a confusing and troubling picture. I didn't know what to do next, but I could clearly sense that the situation was slipping out of my control, and as we left the shop, I realized that our trip to the market hadn't eased the tension. It had only made it more tangible, more ominous. We returned from the market in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The old letters and the mysterious music box had added even more uncertainty to our already tense state. I felt an invisible weight pressing harder on my shoulders. Andrew also looked thoughtful. His gaze occasionally drifted to the window as if he was trying to find answers to some inner questions to try and relieve some of the tension. I suggested we take a walk to the lake and have a picnic. The lake had always been my place of peace and solitude, where I felt safe. I hoped the walk would help us both find some balance. We walked along a winding path surrounded by tall trees until we reached the old wooden dock. Andrew immediately suggested we go for a swim like we used to do when he spent summers with us as a child. "Come on, the water is so warm," he shouted with a smile that suddenly seemed too bright, too desperate. I laughed watching him dive into the lake, breaking the smooth surface of the water into 1,000 tiny splashes. He seemed so young and full of life that I suddenly felt older and more vulnerable than ever before. The water, the sun, his laughter, it all seemed unreal, like a scene from long ago when everything was simpler and clearer. Andrew swam back to the shore, his hair wet, water droplets running down his face, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He came closer, laughing, and splashed water at me. I flinched in surprise and laughed back at that moment. I felt him come even closer, so close that I could hear his heartbeat quicken. He looked at me with such determination, as if trying to reach deep into my thoughts. "You know, Evelyn," he began, his voice quiet but confident, "you've always been more to me than just an aunt. I can't hide it anymore." I froze, not knowing what to say. There was something dangerous in his words, as if he had crossed the line I was trying to draw. Panic spread inside me. "Andrew, you don't understand what you're saying," I said, trying to stay calm. "No, I do," he replied firmly, taking another step closer to me. "Maybe you're just afraid to admit it." And before I could say anything, he leaned in and kissed me again. But this kiss was different. It was full of spontaneity and determination, and I felt something tighten inside me. His lips were warm, filled with confusion and intensity, as if he were trying to express all his unresolved feelings in this one moment. At first I stood still stunned, but then I felt a strange warmth rising within me. It seemed as if everything around us disappeared and there were only the two of us on this old dock surrounded by the mirror-like surface of the lake. For a second, I gave in to the feeling, but then I abruptly pulled away as if waking up from a strange dream. "No, Andrew," I said, feeling my voice tremble. This shouldn't have happened. We need to stop." His face twisted with pain for a moment, but then he became serious again. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you so afraid of this?" I didn't know how to answer, and a sense of helplessness grew inside me because it was wrong. I finally managed to say, "You're still young. You're just confused." He stepped back, his face becoming even more serious. "Do you really think this is just confusion?" he said bitterly. "I feel like I found something real here, something that can't just be ignored." "Andrew, we need to go back home," I said, trying to change the subject. Sensing that this conversation was leading us into dangerous territory, I turned and walked away from the lake, trying to hide the trembling in my hands. I heard him catching up to me, but I didn't look back. We walked in silence, and I felt something invisible settle between us, something more than just words or actions. It was a shadow I couldn't ignore, a shadow that seemed to grow darker with each step, pushing us toward the edge of something unknown and frightening. When we returned home, the evening lights slipped across the walls, painting them in warm shades of orange and pink. I felt exhausted, like after a long, heavy sleep. That leaves a vague sense of anxiety. Andrew went to his room, and I stayed in the kitchen, mindlessly sorting through the products we had bought at the market. Inside me, a whirlwind of emotions still raged: guilt, fear, pain, and something else I couldn't identify. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. It was an unexpected, sharp knock, as if someone had come with urgent news or a pressing matter. I flinched and went to open it, not knowing what to expect. Standing at the door was my mother, Ella. She looked anxious with worry on her face. "Mom, what's happened?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease inside me. Ella looked at me sharply, as if studying every line of my face. "I need to talk to you," she said, entering the house as if she owned it, rather than being a guest, and with Andrew too. I felt everything inside me tense up. "Why with Andrew?" I asked cautiously, closing the door behind her, because I knew something was going on between you two. She said directly, her words hitting like a punch to the stomach. I immediately felt a wave of panic overwhelm me. "What do you mean?" I tried to feign ignorance, but my voice betrayed me, trembling. "Don't pretend, Evelyn," she replied sharply. "I've seen the way you look at each other, and you can't hide that expression on your face. Tell me the truth." I felt everything turn upside down inside me. Mom had always been perceptive, too attentive to details. There's nothing between us. Mom, I said calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. We're just confused. It's a difficult time for both of us. Ella gave me a skeptical look. Her face remained stern, confused. Evelyn, it's more than that. I heard Andrew saying something to you this morning. He isn't hiding his feelings. I felt fear rise within me. What did he tell you? I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't say anything specific. She replied, but I saw his face when he left. He's clearly in love with you, and that's wrong. Evelyn, you have to stop this before everything gets out of control. At that moment, Andrew appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. His face was serious but calm. What are you talking about? He asked, his eyes darting between me and Ella. That something is happening here that isn't right. Ella said sharply, turning to him, you need to understand that this can't continue. Andrew tensed up, and I saw the same spark in his eyes that I had seen by the lake. You don't understand, he said, his voice steady, but tinged with irritation. I know what I feel, and this isn't just some whim. Andrew, stop. I intervened, trying to take control of the situation. You shouldn't talk about this like that. It's more complicated than it seems. Ella turned to me abruptly. You tell him to stop, but you can't do it yourself, can you? Well, I can't just leave it like this. I'm going to call your father. Andrew, let him decide what to do. No, Mom, don't, I almost shouted, feeling my words hang in the air, but it was too late. Andrew, standing in the doorway, froze. Are you serious? He asked quietly, but there was an undertone of anxiety in his voice. You're going to involve my father? Is that all you can do? Yes, I am. Ella replied firmly, because I see you're getting entangled in this, and I won't let you both ruin your lives. Andrew looked at me, his eyes filled with disappointment. Did you know she would do this? He asked, and I felt everything inside me tighten. No, I didn't know. I mumbled, feeling the pain rising inside. Andrew turned to Ella. Fine, he said coldly. If you think getting my father involved will fix everything, then go ahead. But I'm leaving. I'm not going to stay here and listen to you decide what's right for me. He turned and quickly headed for the door without looking back. Ella, agitated and angry, also made her way to the exit, giving me one last look full of disappointment. You should have been smarter. Evelyn, she threw over her shoulder before the door closed behind her. I was left alone in the quiet, empty house, feeling the cold walls closing in around me. I knew something important had just snapped like a thin thread that couldn't be tied back together, and whatever happened next, I could no longer avoid the consequences. So here we are at the point where everything changes. But the real question is, how do we move forward from here? What would you do if someone you trusted crossed a line you never expected? Would you walk away, or would you try to make sense of it all? Because sometimes it's not just about what happens, but how it makes us feel deep down. Stay tuned, because this journey is far from over.